And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today is, as you've been hearing, the first Sunday in Lent. I know it's a season you've been waiting for. You've marked it out on your calendars with big purple letters, Lent! Exclamation point. Lent has an interesting place, of course, in the minds of liberal Christians. For some, it evokes a time to give up something, like chocolate or swearing. For others, Lent brings to mind something that Roman Catholics did when you were a kid. So why are we celebrating Lent? We're not Catholic, and most of us are still happily munching on our stores of dark chocolate. Lent has a long history in the Christian church. The word Lent is derived from the old Germanic word for lengthen, because, of course, these were the days of the seasons when the sunlight began to lengthen. The season had its origins in Holy Week, when those preparing for baptism on the Easter Vigil would fast. Over time, the season was lengthened from a few days to 40 days, not including Sundays. These 40 days are meant to symbolize Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. At its core, Lent is a time when we prepare for Easter. Historically, it has been a penitential season, a time of fasting and prayer. But those increased devotions of fasting and prayer are designed for a specific purpose. They're meant to point us to the great celebration of Easter. Now, if you want to take on a new spiritual discipline this Lent, or do any of the things that Sally had mentioned just a moment before, I am all for it. This is a great opportunity to read that portion of the Bible that you've always wanted to read and never quite gotten around to. I know you guys don't read the Bible as often as you might think, or at least I might think. Pick one of the Gospels. Pick one and create a plan for reading it in the next 40 days. When was the last time you read a Gospel through, cover to cover? Commit to praying when you get up each morning if you don't do so already. Perhaps there's a book of Lenten devotionals you'd like to use. We can recommend some for you. And while you engage in some new spiritual discipline, I want to use these weeks to delve deeply into theology. In my experience, most mainline preachers don't spend much time preaching on theology. I think that's a pity because there's such a rich theological tradition within the liberal church. Theology is meant to clarify our thinking about God and life. It enriches our faith. And so, when I was considering what to preach on during Lent, I decided, let's preach on sin. There is a topic that's appropriate for a penitential season like Lent. I have to admit that Judy and Anne-Marie looked at me a little oddly when I announced that I wanted to preach 4 Sunday sermons on sin. We debated putting up a banner on the front line advertising the sermon series, but then thought better of it. Sin isn't generally a topic that packs the pews on Sunday mornings. I don't know how many people would see the banner on Route 16 and think to themselves, gosh, I've got to go to that church. I've always wanted to know more about sin. But as I mentioned in my sermon a couple weeks ago on divorce, I'm not someone who likes to avoid hard topics. So why not tackle one of the most uncomfortable topics out there? I figure if I get all the hard stuff out now, think of how happy you'll be when we get to Easter. You'll be like, finally, something joyful coming from the pulpit. But in all seriousness, I think sin is a fascinating topic. And I hope by the end of the sermon series, you'll agree with me. The first thing we have to address when talking about sin is our natural and often quite strong aversion to the topic. Why do so many people bristle at the sound of that word? In part, it evokes images of old-time Southern revivalists with their floppy Bibles in hand, sweating through their linen suits while preaching on the dangers of hell and brimstone. Closer to home, some Congregationalists think of Jonathan Edwards, stiffly dressed in a black robe, preaching sinners in the hands of an angry God. But once we put those images away, after all, you're not likely to hear that style of preaching here, we're left with a far more obvious reason why people don't like talk about sin. We don't like feeling guilty. No one likes being reminded of the things they did wrong. It depresses us. Human beings have an innate capacity to justify our own actions. Why should we be made to feel guilty about something like getting angry when everybody loses their temper from time to time? Do you really want me to feel guilty about not volunteering more time or not giving more money to good causes? My bet is that all of you, since you're here in these pews, volunteer and donate far more than the average person. It's uncomfortable to consider how much more we have than those in the rest of the world. Should we feel guilty about the success in our life? Should you feel guilty about a broken relationship when nearly everyone has broken relationships in their life? It's not that those are good things, but why dwell on them? The feeling of guilt also pushes people away from churches. I remember years ago attending the largest church in Iowa. It was a Lutheran church with a strong evangelical flavor. The service had your typical praise and worship band, playing music far too loudly while virtually no one sang. But what surprised me most about the worship service is that it did not include a confession of sin. Martin Luther loved sin. He obsessed over it. Initially, Luther retained confession as one of the sacraments of the church because he appreciated it so much. And yet, there I was, sitting in a conservative Lutheran church that didn't mention sin once. Why? They were laser focused on church growth, and sin, with all its feelings of guilt, only pushed people away. In the years since, I have attended many evangelical churches, and not one of them that I can remember included a confession of sin as a part of the liturgy. But beyond the pressures of church growth and our collective discomfort with guilt, there are some very good reasons to avoid talk of sin. Sin, talking about it, dwelling on it, can cause real harm. When I worked as the undergraduate chaplain at Harvard, I started a service on Sunday evenings that was geared towards undergrads. It was a candlelit service with communion every Sunday. We had a robust fellowship time afterwards to build community. As part of the service, we had a silent confession of sin. For a few minutes at the beginning of every service, we invited people to think about the ways they had done wrong or to consider the broken places in their lives. Then we offered an assurance of pardon so that everyone knew that they were loved by God in spite of their failings. Compared with some confessions of sin, I thought it was pretty tame and altogether appropriate. One of the students who attended the services was Amanda. She'd grown up in New York City and rediscovered Christianity in part through those very services. She even asked to be baptized, something that she had not had done when she was a child. But then, after a while, I noticed that Amanda stopped coming to church. I reached out to her and we had a chance to talk. In that conversation, she spoke openly about her struggles with a severe eating disorder. Her eating disorder became so severe that it required inpatient treatment. She told me how, every time she reflected on sin during our confessional moment, she became racked with guilt and shame over her body, her inability to overcome her eating disorder, the disappointment of her parents and friends. Her self-recriminations were so profound that she could never hear the assurance of pardon. In fact, she would spend the rest of the day stewing on her failings. And even though she liked church, coming to the services and saying that confession led her to a place of deep darkness. Thinking about sin actually caused harm. When I first arrived at First Congregational in Houston, I instituted a similar silent confession. I preached a sermon on sin and wanted to see how the congregation would respond. You see, that congregation there had not had a prayer of confession in decades. This was a new thing for them. One of the church members reached out to me shortly after for a meeting. In that conversation, she explained how she hears the confession. For her, having grown up in a conservative Christian environment, the confession brought back the spiritual wounds she carried with her from her childhood. Having just arrived at FCC Houston, the confession of sin was not a hill I was going to die on, and so after a few Sundays, I removed it. I certainly heard what that church member was saying. Talk of sin sometimes leaves wounds, real wounds. And sometimes a confession doesn't bring us closer to God, but farther away. Now, this is something that I know all too well as a gay man. I grew up at a time when the HIV/AIDS crisis was still raging. Somehow, as a boy, I internalized much of the hatred that I heard around me. When I was in 4th grade here in Wellesley, one of the popular rock bands was New Kids on the Block. That's a blast from the past for some of you. Anyway, one day, one of the kids in 4th grade proclaimed that New Kids on the Block were gay. Now, in reality, this was not the case. But as 4th graders, we weren't very good at discerning fact from fiction in these matters. In response to this new revelation, we brought our cassette tapes of New Kids on the Block to school. And then at one point, we went to the parking lot at Schofield School and ritually smashed the cassettes with our shoes. By 4th grade, we'd internalized the message that gay was bad and that the way to deal with homosexuality was through violence. By 4th grade. Not surprisingly, when I came out, I had a hard time. And when I worked at Wapping Community Church in South Windsor, Connecticut during divinity school, the senior minister asked me to come out of the closet in my final sermon to the congregation. That congregation was then debating having civil unions in the church, and the senior minister wanted to put a face to the issue. So I wrote a sermon on it. And I chose for my text our reading this morning from Jeremiah. The text very much spoke to where I was at that time. Cursed be the day on which I was born. The day on which my mother bore me, let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, saying, a child is born to you, a son, making him very glad. Let that man be like the cities that the Lord overthrew without pity. Let him hear a cry in the morning and an alarm at noon, because he did not kill me in the womb. So my mother would have been my grave, and her womb forever great. Why did I come forth from the womb to see toil and sorrow and spend my days in shame? Not a happy sermon. When I read this sermon to the associate pastor, she simply told me that, no, you really should not preach that sermon. Because, she said, you're not ready to proclaim any good news. And she was right, and I didn't preach that sermon. But I certainly knew the intensity of guilt that I felt, and the way that connected with the word sin. And when I first got to Memorial Church, I'm not joking on this, I actually arranged my books in my office into the bookshelf of life and the bookshelf of death. On the bookshelf of life, I put the books that I allowed myself to read because they affirmed me and who God had made me to be. The bookshelf of death contained the writers who spoke most convincingly about sin, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Soren Kierkegaard, and Karl Barth. Reading those books put me in a very dark place, so they stayed on the bookshelf of death. So yeah, I understand the difficulty with talking about sin. Trust me, I get it. I understand those people who only want to emphasize love and mercy and acceptance. It makes a lot of sense. But if we get rid of the language of sin, if we purge it from our theological lexicon, what are we to do with texts like our reading this morning from the prophet Amos? In it, Amos condemns those in his own society who oppress the poor and make a mockery of the worship of God. The reality is that there are people in society who do bad things. What do we say about those things? Nothing but love, mercy, and acceptance? Several years ago, Martin Shkreli and his hedge fund bought the rights to the drug Daraprim and then promptly raised the price by 5,455%. The drug was beyond its patent, but there was not a huge demand for it. It didn't make sense to have multiple factories producing the drug. In purchasing the only factory that produced the drug, Shkreli forced those who needed it to pay exorbitant prices. Shkreli is very much the person that Amos was decrying those many years ago in the passage that Bob read earlier. What about companies that knowingly cause harm and lie about it to make a profit? I think about Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis in the United States. Purdue Pharma had internal research that showed the dangers of addiction of OxyContin. Yet, they marketed the drug as one that did not lead to addiction and incentivized doctors to prescribe it. Wholesalers like McKesson knowingly sent thousands and thousands of pills to individual pharmacies. It was clear that those pharmacies were dispensing opioids to those who were addicts. McKesson did this, claimed innocence, and then walked away with the profits. You can make similar cases for the tobacco giants and their advertising towards children for many decades, or countless mining firms over the years, or any number of other firms that put the lives of people at risk for their own profits. What about human trafficking? There are those who kidnap people to put them into sweatshops or into sex slavery. Do people of faith have no language to talk about these things? Are these things not an offense to God? You might say that we can just use the language of moral reasoning to talk about good and evil. We don't need to use the word sin. But does God have no role in thinking through good and evil for Christians? After all, that's what sin's about, the role of God and faith in thinking through these questions. Moreover, moral reasoning itself is often ambiguous. What framework for moral reasoning, after all, should we use? Are we to be utilitarians? Those who want the greatest good for the greatest number of people? As attractive as that is in theory, I have yet to meet a single thoroughgoing utilitarian. When someone finds him or herself on the losing side of utilitarianism, that person generally discovers the flaws in utilitarianism very quickly. Should we adopt the moral reasoning of Ayn Rand and objectivism that claims that selfishness is the highest virtue and that altruism is wrong? Without God, how do we judge what moral reasoning framework is right, is true? People of faith have historically had a lot to add to these conversations. Yet when we remove talk of sin, how do we engage with them? Sure, we can use other language like transgression or evil as opposed to sin, but it's fundamentally talking about the same thing. Regardless of the word we use, we need to use something. Our faith should shape how we talk about right and wrong, whether we use the word sin or not. The reality is that there's a real need for complex thinking on these matters. Take, for example, the issue of sweatshops. Global capitalism means that we have our clothes produced for incredibly low prices. That benefits many people, not only consumers like us, but also the many people who get jobs in developing countries making clothing. But when do these conditions of the factory slide into oppression? And what is our responsibility to be aware of that when it happens, and to therefore change our patterns? The same thing holds true for the oil and gas industry. Whether you like it or not, our world runs on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels provide a cheap source of energy that has lifted billions of people out of poverty. But fossil fuels are also the main contributor to global warming, and our purchase of them often supports bad actors. Putin's war in Ukraine is being financed right now with oil and gas revenue. Where is the morality of these issues? And how do we think about them? It's complex, as our lives are. But surely religious people should have something to say. Then there are our own personal failings, which we know all too well. There are certain things we do, like cheating on a spouse or a partner, that we know we should not do. We know we should not lie, particularly when that lying hurts others, but we do it. We do get angry and jealous in ways that hurt ourselves and hurt others. We often don't deal with stress and anxiety in constructive ways. Certainly aware of that. We prioritize things that we know we should not make so central in our lives. I could go on, but you get the point. No one denies that there are certain things that are right and wrong. No one denies, or no one who has thought about these issues of morality in any depth would claim that these issues are always simple or clear. They're not. Everyone admits that sometimes we act in ways that we regret. Surely, religious people should have ways to talk about these things, ways that show the seriousness and depth with which we take them. But Christianity also is also a religion of grace and mercy and love. We need space for healing and wholeness as well. But we cannot find healing and wholeness without first being able to name what the issues are. More than anything else, that is why we need a robust language to talk about sin. It's not about feeling guilty or shameful. Those are not positive Christian values. It's about finding a way to a better world for ourselves and for others. And we cannot find a way out of a bad situation unless we have the language to name exactly what that situation is and how we got there. That is what theology can help us with. That is why language around sin matters so much for us as Christians. It helps us to make sense of the world and points to how and where we can find redemption. Ignoring sin won't make sin go away. it'll only leave us poorer in our ability to talk about real life and real healing. Now, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, we must tread carefully when we delve deeply into the nature of sin, and I will strive to do that. I know firsthand the dangers of talking about sin, but I'm also aware of the need we have to use some type of language when we talk about it. Now, our next step is to brush aside all our long-inherited conceptions of sin and discover ways of thinking about it anew. What does make sense in the 21st century when we talk about sin? What are new enlightening frameworks we can use? How can those frameworks lead to greater wholeness through our faith in God? How does the cross fit into our thinking? I can see you're on the edge of your pews just waiting for an answer. Sadly, you'll have to wait for the Sundays to come. There'll be a lot to talk about. Whoever said that sermons can't end with cliffhangers?